What's the difference between philosophy and science?
Well, roughly you'd say science is what we know and philosophy is what we don't know.
Geocentrism was the view that the Earth was the center of the world, and everything else revolved around it. However, Nicholas Copernicus would question this view in 1543. He proposed that the planets revolved around the sun. His theories were expanded on and eventually proven to be true, and would spark the seeds of a revolution. In the late 17th century, the Enlightenment would start to gain traction. Immanuel Kant defined it as such, quote, "Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity." What Kant meant was that we were like children who trusted that the authorities had the answers to our problems. But now we were free and actually moving towards the right direction instead of delegating all our responsibilities to the authorities. We were suddenly making progress like never before. Grand narratives were established, rationality, liberalism, knowledge, and science at the forefront of the movement. Have the courage to use your own understanding, Kant would proclaim. It would be the age of scientific progress and rationalism. But it would also serve as a critique to dogmatic religion at the time. Quite famously, Baruch Spinoza would critique the widely accepted notion of God at the time, and regardless of the validity of his statements, his abstraction of God would lead to further questions. Quote, "Spinoza's denial on the basis of strict philosophical reasoning of the existence of a transcendent supreme being, his identification of God with nature gives strong impetus to the strands of atheism and naturalism that thread through Enlightenment philosophy." Many scientists would actually adopt this notion of God, most famously, perhaps, Albert Einstein. You might be wondering at this point, what in the world does this have to do with meaning? Well, our perception of our value as human beings was slowly cut down. As we progressed, we understood how small we were in the universe, and eventually we found ourselves asking if anything mattered. The key word of all of these past ideas and even diseases that are now extinct is was. Smallpox was, the Enlightenment was, and so on. Was is past tense, and eventually the word was propagated throughout our dictionaries. In Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, there's a passage attributed to Michael Welfare, who was a religious leader. Quote, "When we were first drawn together as a society, it had pleased God to enlighten our minds, so far as to see that some doctrines, which we once esteemed truths, were actually errors, and others which we had esteemed errors were real truths. Progress requires us to unlearn new things, to learn new things. In other words, it requires sacrifice. Ultimately, in 1883, this led Friedrich Nietzsche to question if God was an error. Most famously through the character of the madman, Nietzsche would proclaim that God is dead and we have killed him. Now, just for clarification, this is not a religious claim, and he's not advocating for atheism. Nietzsche is not saying that God is actually dead and that we have actually killed him, but rather that we have entered the age of secular scientism, abandoning the era of religion. He says the following, "The belief in the Christian God has become unbelievable. Everything that was built upon this faith, propped up by it, grown into it, including the whole of our European morality, is destined for collapse." It is with this death of God that Bertrand Russell says, quote, "Only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built." Or Samuel Beckett, a playwright who writes a play where the curtains open up to a floor of garbage, with faint sounds of crying and breathing. The stage then closes after 30 seconds. That's it. These are the starting phases of civilization's spirit, breaking after world wars, which was presaged by Friedrich Nietzsche. As cliché as Nietzsche's proclamation is for everyone to use in their mid-tier philosophy videos, it very well spells out the growing disbelief in an ultimate meaning that people have based their lives on, and the incipient stages of a shift in the cultural zeitgeist. Things once thought to be divine were now explained by science, and Nietzsche believed that this would eventually lead people, most people, to nihilism and moral ambiguity. Just a side note on Nietzsche. There's a growing misunderstanding of Nietzsche's statement, some stating that he is a nihilist. This is, to put it simply, wrong. In fact, he believed that nihilism was irrational. Furthermore, some purport that Nietzsche is upset that the meaning of life and value of life is destroyed. To be sure, if you look at only this passage from the madman, it does look that way. He says that God is dead, God remains dead,
and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderer of all murderers, the most holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned, has bled to death under our knives? Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us?
However, we do have to remember that he is saying this through a character named the Madman, which is a direct reference to Diogenes the Cynic, who lit lanterns in broad daylight, masturbated in public, urinated on people. So it's hard to take that particular passage literally. Additionally, in the later revised version of The Joyous Science, the quote where that originates from, he says that the event fills him with gratitude, amazement, anticipation, and expectation. So it's probably better to think of it as a statement that is bad for Europe or civilization more generally right now, but in the end results in good and flourishing for everybody. Now, you can believe that life is meaningless without God, but all I claim is that this was not Nietzsche's interpretation of the event. But back to the point. Meaning from the heavens was now ambiguous. In Japan, there's a heavenly destiny or order that is given to humans individually. In Hinduism, it might look something like the Dharma, and there are many more examples. The point is, a lot of people believe that we had meaning that was prescribed to us. However, with this event now past, people started to slowly believe this was not the case.
You quote Nietzsche quite a bit. His line, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." What do you think he meant by that?
Viktor Frankl was a Jewish psychiatrist who survived 4 death camps during the Holocaust. He believed that there was this thing inside us called the will to meaning, which is basically the insatiable drive to find meaning in our lives. However, a philosopher like Albert Camus, for example, might say that this is exactly the problem. A meaning-seeking creature navigating a seemingly meaningless universe is exactly the human condition for Camus. The absurdity of existence leads Camus into wondering, why shouldn't we suicide if it all means nothing? But in the end, Frankl and Camus both reject suicide, but they reject it for different reasons. Frankl analogizes offing yourself to playing a game of chess, but instead of playing by the rules and trying to beat the opponent, you table flip and walk away. He asserts that just as it is incorrect to disregard the rules of chess when playing, it is equally incorrect to violate the rules of life. He says that, quote, "These rules of life do not require us to win at all cost, but they do demand from us that we never give up the fight." He thought that in the end, suicide is an escape. It's like moving into another house because your toilet doesn't flush. But just to warn you, that toilet still doesn't flush even if you move to another house. He observed that even in the concentration camps, there was never a moment where meaning ceased to exist. Even if meaning was surrounded by fog, it was still there. During his time, he observed that, quote, "The meaning of life differs from man to man, from day to day, from hour to hour." Think about it this way. The past is gone, and the future is yet to be. Then all we are left with is the present moment. The meaning of life cannot encompass the entire past, present, and future. It can only be actualized in the moment. Just like a song, the meaning of life is to be found right now. If the point of a song was to get to the end, this would be Kanye's next album. Boom. But the point of a song is to enjoy it in the moment. Similarly, Frankl believes that the meaning of life changes. Maybe in this moment it's finding water. The next moment it might be securing love or safety, and so on. But it never ceases to be, just like a song. Frankl, through his time in the concentration camps, would credit much of his survival to finding meaning and happiness in small things. But he would also push back against the somewhat common notion that happiness or pleasure in itself is the meaning of life. He says that pleasure in itself cannot give our existence meaning. Thus, the lack of pleasure cannot take away meaning from life. He reasons that happiness is actually just a result of living the meaningful life instead of the meaning of life in itself. He says that, quote, "Happiness cannot be pursued, it must ensue." In other words, happiness cannot be sought for. It must be the effect of something. Perhaps C.S. Lewis put it best. Quote, "If you look for truth, you may find comfort in the end. If you look for comfort, you will not get either comfort or truth. Only soft soap and wishful thinking to begin, and in the end, despair." In this society, meaning is constantly externalized instead of internalized. Instead of thinking, hey, if I try my best for this exam, even though I get a bad grade, I will know I tried my best, and that is enough. We instead think something more like, okay, if I don't get an A this time, or even more external success, I won't be happy. No, in fact, I can't be happy unless I get that thing. We put so much worry on what's going on around us, instead of what we can actually do, that we start to lose ourselves. We connect work to something like getting money, which in turn leads to buying more things, which in turn leads to our family being more happy, which in turn leads to our happiness and meaning. So, to answer the question of why fulfillment and meaning seems to be so hard to find nowadays, it seems that there's just so many barriers for us to find meaning and for us to be happy in this modern world.
I sometimes think about this. I'm like, if I just pulled over the side of the road, I bet you there's an anthill there and their whole world is fascinating. You can't stay there. And you also can't stay staring up at the clouds and just think about how we're just these little beings and it doesn't matter.
So before we get into how to go about living a meaningful life, I want to contest the idea that we need something at the top of our value hierarchy for us to act at all. Now, this might seem completely irrelevant, but I want to try to demonstrate that it is not. Now, Jordan Peterson takes this view that there must exist a chain of justifications for any action at all. Here's him saying it.
Why are you writing this essay? Well, so that I can get a grade for the class. Why are you taking the class? So that I can finish my year at university. Why are you finishing your year at university and motivated to do that? To get my degree. And then that's a whole hierarchy of value that is definitely governing either in an integrated manner or a disintegrated manner the actions of the person who's writing the essay. And you might say, well...
But I would push back on this notion. Philosopher Thomas Nagel comments in his paper, The Absurd, that things are sometimes ends in themselves. He says, quote, "Life does not consist of a sequence of activities, each of which has as its purpose some later member of the sequence. Chains of justification come repeatedly to an end within life, and whether the process as a whole can be justified has no bearing on the finality of these endpoints. No further justification is needed to make it reasonable to take an aspirin for a headache, attend an exhibit of the work of a painter one admires, or stop a child from putting his hand on a hot stove. No larger context or further purpose is needed to prevent these acts from being pointless." So I want to use this idea that there doesn't always need to be further justification for things to remove some barriers to meaning. And the most pressing barrier to meaning or happiness is actually biological. You see, although biology cannot fundamentally tell us why we are unwell, we can still use it to feel well. We can use biology to an end in itself. So to do that, I'm going to be referring to the work of Andrew Huberman, a neuropsychologist who a neurobiologist who turns his focus on helping people with information in his area of expertise. A huge part of why people feel meaningless or unfulfilled in their lives is because their dopamine levels are low. Even someone like Viktor Frankl, who survived 4 concentration camps, had to use biological realities to his advantage. The difference between someone like Viktor Frankl, who has the determination to will himself through a concentration camp, and someone who gives up after the first day of work is, at least partly, dopamine. Dopamine is, quote, "not just responsible for pleasure, it is responsible for motivation and drive." So, how do you get your baseline of dopamine higher, so you are more fulfilled in activities and more motivated in them as well? Well, I don't have time to go into all the details, but things like getting sunlight, exercising, taking cold showers, and ingesting small amounts of caffeine increase dopamine levels. I'll do a whole separate video on how dopamine works and how you can use it to your advantage one day. But right now, focus on these things for an increase in the baseline of dopamine. There are a lot of people, anecdotally speaking, that seem to be aimless in their lives. But this can be partially explained by their biological state of affairs. So if you want to live a happier life, I recommend trying these things as well as listening to Andrew Huberman's podcast. Now, I know this video is getting really long, but please bear with me, because I think this topic is extremely important. It is our duty to try to grasp at the meaning of life. Quote, "As long as we have breath, as long as we are still conscious, we are each responsible for answering life's questions." I'm going to skip over Frankl's beliefs on the meaning of life, but I just want to briefly say that there are a lot of views on this topic, and it's very complicated. So, with that in mind, although this is not an all-encompassing view of meaning in philosophy, I will try my best to give you 3 very brief viewpoints on the meaning of life. To introduce this first theory, I'm going to use a diagram I found a while back. It's a Japanese concept that roughly translates to the reason for living. This diagram doesn't really accurately represent the original meaning of the Japanese word, but the point is that you can't just live for subjective meaning alone. For this first theory, if you want to fulfill your purpose, you also need to match it with the objective value it provides to the world. To further explore this concept, I'm going to explore the work of Susan Wolf, a philosopher who says, quote, "Meaning arises when subjective attraction meets objective attraction. That is, a conception according to which meaning comes from active engagements in projects of worth." In other words, you can't just do things that are useless for a meaningful life. You need to have a passion while also doing something worthwhile. Now, this is an oversimplification of her work, so you can check it out here. But we are moving on to number 2. Number 2, life is objectively meaningful. People in this camp usually believe that life is meaningful because there is a deity, and the relationship with that deity gives meaning to human life. For example, William Lane Craig, sometimes labeled as the greatest defender of Christian faith, says that, quote, "Only if God exists can there be purpose in life." He thinks that atheists are playing a classic bait and switch. Now, I'm not exactly sure about Susan Wolf's view on religion, but assuming that she is an atheist, Dr. Craig might say that there's no reason for her to think that anything is meaningful without God. People just say that there is no meaning and then pretend like life does have meaning, which is just dishonest philosophy for Dr. Craig. Here's him on the meaning of life.
The question, is there meaning to life, is closely connected to another equally profound question, namely, does God exist? For if God does not exist, there is no transcendent reality. And so both mankind and the universe, as a result, are inevitably doomed to death.
He further shows the seeming despair humans find themselves in without God, and how we can resolve this with belief in God. In his book, he proclaims that, "For if there is no God, the man's life becomes absurd." Number 3, life is absurd. The philosopher I mentioned earlier, Thomas Nagel, for example, would probably disagree with Dr. Craig that life is entirely meaningless without God. He would, however, agree that life is absurd. Nagel notes 3 things in his paper, The Absurd. The first thing is that it isn't the case that just because life won't matter in 1,000,000 years, say, life doesn't matter right now. He says, quote, "It is often remarked that nothing we do will matter in 1,000,000 years. But if that is true, then by the same token, nothing that will be the case in 1,000,000 years matters now." Similarly, he thinks that the size of something doesn't affect its significance. Just because we are blips in the universe doesn't make our lives entirely meaningless. Lastly, just because something ends doesn't make it meaningless. He thinks that not everything needs to be justified outside itself, like the child putting his hand on a hot stove. It just hurts. Or playing music to solve our existential dread. If because the universe is going to end, nothing matters, then, for example, we couldn't create art because someday no one would be able to appreciate it. But this is not the case for Thomas Nagel. Nagel's conclusion that life's absurdity is actually good because it brings about the most human within us. And a lot of the problems surrounding meaning come about because we just take it all so seriously. To end the paper, he says, "If subspecie aeternitatis, that is, in a universal perspective, there is no reason to believe that anything matters, then that doesn't matter either, and we can approach our absurd lives with irony instead of heroism or despair." And that is all I have for you today.